We are only days away from Christmas morning, a moment when much of the world slows down. Families gather, gifts are wrapped, meals are planned. But while holiday lights glow across much of the globe, time is accelerating elsewhere. For Russian forces in Ukraine, the pressure is tightening. Ukraine has compressed the battlefield, limited options, and forced Moscow into increasingly reactive decisions. As the calendar moves toward Christmas Day, for many communities living under the weight of this war, there is no talk of celebration. There is only one thing that matters now: hope. In the early hours before dawn, a missile cut through the night sky at speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. Its destination was not a frontline trench. It was not a radar station or an ammunition depot. Instead, it was aimed at something far more personal, far more symbolic, and far more damaging to the authority of the man who has ruled Russia for more than 2 decades. That morning, Vladimir Putin's Black Sea Palace, a sprawling, heavily guarded complex hidden along the coastline near Gelendzhik, was struck. With that single strike, Ukraine did not simply damage a structure. It challenged the mythology that has sustained Putin's rule. This is the story of what happened when Ukraine crossed a line Moscow once described as unthinkable. It is the story Russian state media avoids, and it is a story whose consequences extend far beyond a single building. To understand the impact, it's important to understand the target. Putin's Black Sea residence is not a vacation home. It is not a ceremonial retreat. It is a fortress-like palace complex spanning more than 17,000 acres, an area comparable to Manhattan's financial district. The site includes underground tunnels, reinforced bunkers, a private port, vineyards, an amphitheater, and multiple layers of air defense coverage. Independent investigations estimate the cost of construction at over $1.4 billion. Billion with a B. But the outrage surrounding the palace has never been about architecture alone. It's about what it represents. While Russian pensioners struggle to afford heating, while hospitals lack basic equipment, while conscripts are sent to war with outdated gear, this Mediterranean-style estate was built using money diverted from the Russian state. It stands as a physical embodiment of inequality and corruption at the highest level. For years, the palace was an open secret. Investigative journalists exposed it in a detailed documentary that reached more than 120 million views before being suppressed. Russians knew about it. They joked quietly, they whispered, but the palace remained untouched, a symbol of a ruler beyond accountability, until it wasn't. According to sources close to Ukrainian intelligence, the strike occurred during the early morning hours and involved a coordinated operation using long-range drones, possibly supported by modified Neptune missile systems, the same weapons family credited with sinking Russia's Black Sea Fleet flagship earlier in the war. This was not a spontaneous decision, it was calculated. Ukrainian units are believed to have monitored the site for months. They studied security rotations. They mapped air defense coverage. They identified blind spots in the S-400 systems protecting the area, and they waited for confirmation that Putin was not present. Because this strike was never about assassination, it was about humiliation. An intercepted communication from a Russian officer stationed in Crimea, later leaked through Ukrainian channels, captured the reaction inside the Russian military chain of command. The officer reportedly said, "The palace was hit. The palace was hit. How do we explain this? Everyone involved is finished." That reaction reveals what many outside analysts initially underestimated. This strike was not about military damage. It was about psychological warfare. Authoritarian systems rely heavily on perception. Leaders are not simply administrators, they are symbols. Their authority depends on an image of strength, control, and inevitability. Vladimir Putin has spent decades cultivating that image. The decisive strongman, the restorer of national pride, the leader who cannot be touched. But myths are fragile. They require constant reinforcement. Once cracked, they begin to unravel. By striking the palace, Ukraine sent a message not only to the Kremlin, but to every Russian watching. If the leader cannot protect what matters most to him, what else is vulnerable? A former Russian security official, now living abroad, summarized the impact bluntly in an interview with independent media. "This did more damage than 100 lost battles," he said. "People don't track troop movements, but they understand symbols, and this symbol was destroyed." The Kremlin's response came quickly. Russia's defense ministry issued a statement warning of total annihilation. The phrase was repeated across state television, delivered with visible anger and rigid control. It dominated headlines almost instantly, but analysts noted something unusual. Total annihilation is not standard Russian military terminology. It is not operational language. It is theatrical language, designed primarily for domestic audiences. Western intelligence assessments interpret it differently. When a country is winning, it does not need dramatic threats. It simply advances. When a country is struggling, when a billion-dollar palace is struck by a nation it once dismissed as weak, words begin to compensate for lost authority. Since the start of the war, Moscow has drawn red line after red line. Supplying Western weapons was a red line. Striking Crimea was a red line. Hitting Russian territory was a red line. Each was crossed. Each time the response fell short of the threat. The palace strike may be the clearest demonstration yet that these red lines function as intimidation, not enforceable policy. But this creates a dangerous dynamic. History shows that leaders whose bluffs fail often become unpredictable, not because they are powerful, but because they are cornered. While the palace was being hit, Russian conscripts remained huddled in frozen trenches across eastern Ukraine. Intercepted phone calls released later by Ukrainian intelligence reveal growing disillusionment. In one call, a soldier told his mother, "They say we're winning. They show us videos, but we haven't been paid in months. We're eating expired rations, and now they hit the palace." Another call was even more direct. "We lost 12 men yesterday for a trench we couldn't hold, and he's worried about his palace. Let them hit it again." These are not isolated voices. They reflect a widening gap between official narratives and lived reality. Ukrainian soldiers see the strike differently. For many, it represents proof that the war is not only about territory. One drone operator told an independent journalist, "Every time we hit something he values, we show this is about dismantling the system itself." Military analysts point to three primary reasons Ukraine chose this target at this moment. First, psychological impact. Forcing Russia to defend luxury symbols diverts resources away from operational military targets. Second, internal pressure. The strike generates questions inside Russia that propaganda struggles to answer. Third, international signaling. By hitting a symbolic target rather than civilian infrastructure, Ukraine reinforces the narrative of restraint and precision, but the risks remain significant. Pro-war commentators inside Russia are calling for escalation. Some demand strikes on Ukrainian leadership buildings. Others argue Western infrastructure should be targeted in retaliation. Western intelligence agencies are preparing for potential cyber operations, sabotage, and unconventional responses. The reality is this: Putin can survive battlefield setbacks, he can reframe losses, he can blame generals. But humiliation is harder to survive. History is filled with leaders who fell not when their armies collapsed, but when their image of invincibility did. Intelligence sources suggest Ukraine may continue targeting symbolic sites rather than troop formations, elite residences, retreats, and visible markers of power. Each strike reinforces the same message: Russia cannot defend everything, and every air defense system protecting luxury is one less protecting soldiers. A Ukrainian intelligence official summarized the strategy simply: we're forcing them to choose, protect palaces or protect troops. Every choice exposes priorities. The strike on the Black Sea Palace was more than an attack. It was a declaration that no symbol is untouchable, no illusion permanent. The furious rhetoric from Moscow is not confidence, it is anxiety, because fear only works when the ruler appears invulnerable, and that image has cracked. The question now is not whether Putin felt this strike. The question is what happens next, as the myth continues to erode and the audience at home begins to notice. This is the war beneath the war, the struggle for legitimacy, belief, and authority, and it is being fought one symbol at a time. What makes this moment especially volatile is that symbols once damaged cannot simply be rebuilt. A palace can be repaired, walls can be repainted, air defenses can be reinforced, but the perception created by that strike, the image of vulnerability, lingers far longer than any physical damage. In tightly controlled systems, perception is reality. Authority flows downward from belief, not ballots. And once belief weakens, control becomes far more expensive to maintain. Inside Russia, the information environment is already strained. State media can suppress footage. It can redirect blame. It can amplify threats. But it cannot erase conversations happening quietly between families, soldiers, and communities. When those conversations begin to converge around the same question, why can't he protect what matters to him? The foundation begins to shift, not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. This is why the palace strike matters beyond this war, beyond this season, beyond this headline cycle. It signals a transition from a conflict measured only in territory and troop movements to one measured in legitimacy and belief. Ukraine is not just contesting land, it is contesting authority. And history shows that when authority begins to fracture, even the most heavily guarded regimes can unravel faster than anyone expects. The palace strike will not end the war. It will not collapse the Kremlin overnight, but it has introduced something the system struggles to contain: doubt. And once doubt enters an authoritarian structure, it spreads quietly, persistently, and relentlessly. That is why this moment matters. And that is why, long after the smoke clears from a single compound on the Black Sea coast, the consequences of this strike will continue to shape what comes next. Protect palaces or protect troops, every choice exposes priorities. The strike on the Black Sea Palace was more than an attack. It was a declaration that no symbol is untouchable, no illusion permanent. The furious rhetoric from Moscow is not confidence, it is anxiety, because fear only works when the ruler appears invulnerable, and that image has cracked. The question now is not whether Putin felt this strike. The question is what happens next as the myth continues to erode and the audience at home begins to notice. This is the war beneath the war, the struggle for legitimacy, belief, and authority, and it is being fought one symbol at a time.